Sydney Harbour. 2026. The largest island in the harbour, Cockatoo Island. Warriama, in the Gadigal language of Sydney's First Nations peoples. UNESCO World Heritage, inscribed 31st July 2010. Sydney Biennale Gallery venue. Ferry destination from Circular Quay. Rusting cranes above empty dry docks. Convict-built sandstone barracks and cells. Powerhouse of 1918. Tourist campground. This was Australia's greatest shipyard, from 1857 to 1992. 135 years of Australian naval industrial history. Home to Australia's first dry dock, birthplace of the first warship built wholly in Australia. Repaired the USS New Orleans stern first in 1942. Built HMAS Success in 1984, the largest ship ever built in Australia for the Royal Australian Navy. Ended on the 31st of December 1992. Not by American private equity, not by Swiss multinational, not by Japanese boardroom, by Australian federal government policy. How did Australia destroy its own greatest shipyard? Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian made, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1, 31st December 1992, 2026. Walk to Circular Quay, Sydney. Board the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust ferry to Cockatoo Island. 20-minute crossing across Sydney Harbour, past the Sydney Opera House and the Harbour Bridge, northwest into the inner harbour where the Parramatta and Lane Cove rivers meet. Arrive at Sydney's largest harbour island, 17.9 hectares of sandstone rising to 18 metres, Warriama, in the Gadigal language. What is there in 2026? UNESCO World Heritage Site since the 31st of July 2010. Australian convict sites, World Heritage Property, one of 11 sites inscribed under UNESCO criteria 4 and 6, 2 licensed cafes, Societe Overboard and Marina Cafe. Waterfront campground and glamping accommodation. Sydney Biennale Gallery installations in the industrial workshops, concert venue for Lord, Justin Bieber, other international artists. Dark past and curious tales. Ghost tours, sunset sessions, guided history walks. And everywhere across the island, the rusting cranes. 17 historic cranes still standing. The empty dry docks. The workshops with lathes and machinery still bolted to the floor. The powerhouse of 1918, once the largest open-fronted DC generating plant in Australia, Commonwealth Heritage listed since 2004. The Fitzroy Dock opened 1st of December 1857. Australia's first dry dock, convict-built. The Sutherland Dock, completed March 1890 at a cost of £267,825. All silent, all preserved, all abandoned as working infrastructure. Because on the 31st of December 1992, the Cockatoo Dockyard lease lapsed. Operations had already ceased at the end of December 1991. 135 years after HMS Herald first entered the Fitzroy Dock in 1857, the shipyard that built HMAS Huon, the first warship built wholly in Australia. The shipyard that repaired the USS New Orleans stern first in 1942 after her bow was blown off at the Battle of Tassafaronga. The shipyard that launched HMAS Success in 1984, the largest ship ever built in Australia for the Royal Australian Navy. Ended. Read that again. 31st December 1992, the last day of Australia's greatest shipyard. This is the story of how Australian federal government decisions, not a foreign takeover, not a corporate raider, not a hostile bidder from Detroit or Yokohama or Vevey, closed the naval industrial heart of Sydney Harbour and gave it to the tourists. Chapter 2. Wari-ama, Rewind. Cockatoo Island, Wari-ama in the Gadigal language, is the largest island in Sydney Harbour, at the confluence of the Parramatta and Lane Cove rivers. Originally about 12.9 hectares of sandstone rising to 18 metres, extended by reclamation over the 19th and 20th centuries to 17.9 hectares. 1839. The colonial government of New South Wales establishes a penal establishment on the island for secondary punishment, re-offenders. Convicts sent to Cockatoo Island are the hardest cases in the colonial system. Superintendent Charles Ormsby runs the island from 1839. 5 official inquiries into his management over the next 2 decades. In 1858, the final inquiry reveals systematic corruption. Ormsby has been selling up to 40,000 cabbages a year, grown by convict labour, and keeping pigs and poultry on prisoner rations. He is ousted in 1859, but under Ormsby's watch and later under his successor, Gotha Kerr Mann, convict labour excavates over 580,000 cubic feet of rock from the island, creates 45-foot sandstone cliffs, cuts underground grain silos by hand, Australia's only surviving group of convict-built rock-cut silos, response to the 1837-39 drought. Convict-built sandstone structures still standing on Cockatoo Island in 2026, the prisoners' barracks and hospital of 1839-42. The mess hall of 1847-51. The military guardhouse of 1842. The officers' quarters of 1845-57. Solitary confinement cells. Biloela House, the superintendent's residence, 1841. In 1860, convicts strike over uneven remission of sentences. Ringleaders are marched in irons to Darlinghurst Gaol. The convict era continues until 1869. Then Cockatoo Island transforms. Reformatory School for Girls from 1871. Renamed Biloela, Aboriginal word for cockatoo, softening the reputation. Nautical school ship Vernon moored offshore. Then Sobraon from 1891, housing up to 400 to 500 boys learning trades and nautical skills. Male prisoners returning periodically through to about 1908, but the shipyard has already begun under the convicts. Chapter 3, 1st December 1857. Governor George Gipps had recommended a dry dock at Cockatoo Island in 1846. Verbatim. Cockatoo Island is the best place in Sydney Harbour, which I consider best adapted for a naval establishment. The dry dock would service Royal Navy vessels visiting Sydney. Construction begins around 1847. Sources conflict on the exact start date, giving 1847, 48 or 51. What is certain, Captain Gotha Kerr Mann, Engineer-in-Chief and later Superintendent of Convicts, designs the dry dock and directs the excavation. Convict labour excavates the dock from solid sandstone rock, using gunpowder charges fired by electricity. About a decade of labour. Blood, dust, injuries. Convicts in irons working in Sydney Harbour humidity. 1st of December, 1857. The Her Majesty's surveying vessel Herald enters the completed Fitzroy Dock. First ship, the largest dry dock in the Southern Hemisphere at completion. Named for New South Wales Governor Sir Charles Augustus Fitzroy, who had laid the inverted keystone in 1853. Fitzroy Dock is Australia's first dry dock, and in 2026 it remains Australia's only surviving dry dock built by convicts. The dock is lengthened from 284 feet to 400 feet around 1870, to 475 feet in 1880. HMS Galatea is docked in 1870, but a bigger dock is needed. Sutherland Dock is planned in the 1880s, designed by J.B. Mackenzie under Edward Moriarty, Engineer-in-Chief of the Harbours and Rivers Branch, New South Wales Public Works. The construction contract is won by a 23-year-old engineer named Louis Samuel, lowest of 14 tenders at approximately £135,000. Louis Samuel dies of peritonitis, aged 26, before completing the work. His younger brother, Edward Samuel, takes over and completes the dock. Sutherland Dock is completed in March 1890. Total final cost, £267,825. An 1886 New South Wales Government publication, verbatim. The largest single graving dock yet constructed, capable of receiving the largest vessel afloat, 635 feet long, 84 feet wide. By 1890, Cockatoo Island has two of the largest dry docks in the Southern Hemisphere. Australian naval infrastructure, sitting in Sydney Harbour, ready for the century of shipbuilding to come. Chapter 4. HMAS Huon. The Royal Australian Navy is established in 1911. On the 31st of January, 1913, the Commonwealth purchases Cockatoo Island from the New South Wales Government. Purchase price, £867,716 and 19 shillings. Renamed the Commonwealth Naval Dockyard, Cockatoo Island. HMAS Huon, originally to be named Derwent. A river-class torpedo boat destroyer, laid down at Cockatoo Island on the 25th of January, 1913. Launched on the 19th of December, 1914, by Mrs. Jensen, wife of federal politician J. A. Jensen. Commissioned 14th of December, 1915. Completed 4th of February, 1916. HMAS Huon is the first warship built wholly in Australia, not assembled from British parts, not modified from a British hull. Built entirely on Cockatoo Island by Australian shipwrights from Australian and imported materials for the newly formed Royal Australian Navy. Captain Julian James King Salter is seconded from the British Admiralty in 1914 as General Manager of the dockyard. 3-year term, salary £1,750 plus furnished house. King Salter presides over the wartime work through the end of the First World War. Other World War I era Cockatoo builds. Light cruisers, HMAS Brisbane, laid down 1913 and completed 1916. HMAS Adelaide, laid down 1915, launched 1918, completed 1922. Nicknamed HMAS Long-Delayed by the RAN for its extended construction. Plus the fleet collier HMAS Belloala and the floating crane Titan, assembled 1916 to 1919. By the end of the First World War, the Cockatoo Island dockyard has built over 50 ships, repaired and converted over 150 vessels, fitted out transports for over 120,000 troops and 17,000 horses, and handled nearly 2,000 dockings. And on the 31st of December 1919, the Cockatoo Island dockyard workforce peaks. 4,085 workers. Read that again. 4,085 workers. December 1919. The all-time peak of Cockatoo Island dockyard employment. Higher than any single figure during the Second World War. Set in the aftermath of the First World War, before Australia's Great Depression, before the interwar decline, before Vickers, before Australian national industries. 1919 was the peak. Chapter 5. Vickers. The interwar years bring collapse. In September 1923, control of the dockyard passes to the Australian Commonwealth Shipping Board. The yard begins commercial operation alongside naval work. But a November 1927 High Court ruling holds that the government cannot compete against private enterprise for open contracts. Cockatoo loses a major Bunurong power station contract, combined with the 1928 downturn and then the Great Depression. The Cockatoo workforce collapses from 1,300 workers in 1928 to 560 workers in 1932. Jack Payne, general manager since 1921, dies suddenly of heart failure in his office in 1932. 11 years running the yard. In 1933, commencing trading on the 1st of March, the dockyard is leased to the private Cockatoo Docks and Engineering Company Limited on a 21-year lease from the federal government. The Commonwealth remains the owner of the island and remains the major client. Interwar builds include the seaplane carrier HMAS Albatross, 1926 to 28. Grimsby-class sloops HMAS Yarra, 1934 to 36, and HMAS Swan. HMAS Australia and HMAS Adelaide modernised in the late 1930s. Then in 1947, Vickers Armstrongs of Britain becomes majority shareholder in the operating company. Vickers Cockatoo Docks and Engineering Proprietary Limited is formed in 1948. British ownership of the operating company, but Commonwealth ownership of the physical island continues. The Vickers era, from 1948 through 1984, is Cockatoo's post-war industrial peak. Post-war builds include Daring-class destroyers, HMAS Voyager and HMAS Vampire. Vampire is now preserved as a museum ship at the Australian National Maritime Museum in Darling Harbour. Battle-class destroyer HMAS Tobruk. River-class destroyer escorts HMAS Parramatta, HMAS Stuart, HMAS Derwent, HMAS Torrens. The escort maintenance ship HMAS Stalwart. Notable 1960s repair work. The aircraft carrier HMAS Melbourne after her collisions with HMAS Voyager in 1964 and USS Frank E. Evans in 1969. The last major commercial contract at Cockatoo, the MS Empress of Australia, 1962 to 1965, then the largest roll-on, roll-off passenger ship in the world. New submarine refit facilities open in 1971. A new Sutherland wharf. Oberon-class submarine refits become the yard's principal work through the 1970s and 80s. One of the most advanced non-nuclear submarine refit facilities in the world. But there is a crucial policy change. A new lease agreement, effective 1st of January 1972, removes Cockatoo's preferential treatment for Commonwealth work, except submarines. The yard then unsuccessfully tenders for several large naval shipbuilding projects. The abandoned light destroyer program is cancelled in 1972. The 1972 policy change is the structural turning point. Cockatoo becomes dependent on submarine refits alone. Everything else is now open competition, which Cockatoo will mostly lose. Chapter 6. USS New Orleans. Rewind to the Second World War, 1939. War begins in Europe. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 changes everything. Cockatoo Island becomes the main, and for a period the only, major Allied ship repair base in the southwest Pacific. Captain George Ian Duart Hutchison, commander of the Order of the British Empire, born 1897, died 1965, serves as Royal Australian Navy Principal Overseer at Cockatoo Island Dockyard from 1939 to 1942. Responsible, per his official record, for the construction of 3 Tribal-class destroyers, 2 sloops, 3 boom-working vessels, 8 corvettes and 2 frigates, plus boilers for 46 other corvettes. World War II workforce averages 3,043 workers in 1942, the verified peak for the war years. 19 new ships built during World War II. Major repairs on 40 Allied warships, 750 wartime dockings, 395 merchant, 350 naval. Over £400,000 spent on wartime facility upgrades, turbine shop, brass foundry, plater's shed, welding workshop, new slipway. The 3 tribal-class destroyers built at Cockatoo, HMAS Herald. Laid down 15th of November 1939. Launched 30th of November 1940. Commissioned 30th of March 1942 under Commander James C. Morrow, DSORAN. First of the 3 Australian tribals. HMAS Warramunga. Laid down 10th of February 1940. Launched 7th of February 1942 by Mrs. Frank Ford, wife of the Minister for the Army. Commissioned 23rd of November 1942 under Commander Emile Deschanel, DSCRAN, nicknamed Father by his crew. A contemporary account by a Warramunga sailor verbatim. He was a real rip, tear or bus skipper. He would use any excuse to put her flat out, and we all loved it. HMAS Bataan, launched 15th of January 1944 by Mrs. Douglas MacArthur. Commissioned 25th of May 1945, originally to be named Kurnai or Chingili, renamed Bataan to honour the American stand at the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. Then the Allied warship repairs. USS New Orleans, heavy cruiser, bow blown off at the Battle of Tassafaronga, off Lunga Point, on the 30th of November to 1st of December 1942. She steams stern first to Tulagi for emergency patching, then across the Coral Sea to Sydney. Enters Cockatoo Island for repair on the 28th of December 1942. Remains until the 6th of March 1943. The Cockatoo Docks war record for 1939 to 45, verbatim, with about 150 feet of her bow section from the upper deck to the waterline missing, and led one to wonder how the vessel was ever able to reach port. Cockatoo Island workers, under Hutchison's supervision, fabricate a 150-foot temporary bow section, using approximately 150 tons of steel. The bow is fitted to USS New Orleans in the Sutherland dock. She then crosses the Pacific to the United States for a permanent bow. Sydney's shipwrights save an American heavy cruiser that no one thought would sail again. Also repaired at Cockatoo during World War II, USS Chicago after the Battle of Sabo Island, August 1942. USS Chester, USS Portland after the naval battle of Guadalcanal, 13th of November 1942. HMAS Australia, the first Allied ship struck by kamikaze attacks and the most hit throughout the war. HMAS Hobart, torpedoed near Espiritu Santo. And in 14 days at anchor in Athol Bight, Sydney Harbour, in 1940, the Cunard liner RMS Queen Mary is converted to a troopship. RMS Queen Elizabeth follows. Aquitania follows. Mauritania follows. Australian shipwrights turning Atlantic passenger liners into Pacific troop carriers. Cockatoo Island is the shipyard that keeps the Allied Pacific Fleet afloat. The scale is easy to miss with hindsight. Between the fall of Singapore in February 1942 and the arrival of US Navy shipyard capacity in the Southwest Pacific from mid-1943, Cockatoo Island is not merely the largest ship repair base in the region. It is, for a critical period, the only major Allied ship repair base capable of handling heavy cruisers, aircraft carriers and large transports anywhere in the Southwest Pacific. Every torpedo hit on an Allied warship in the Coral Sea, the Solomons, the Bismarck Sea, the Java Sea. If the warship could still float, it steamed to Sydney, to Cockatoo Island, to Captain Hutchison's shipwrights. to the Fitzroy and Sutherland drydocks, 3,043 workers in 1942, keeping the Pacific War fort at sea. Chapter 7. HMAS Success, Post-War. Vickers era continues into the 1970s. The 1972 policy change begins the slow decline. Submarine refits only. All other naval work, open competition, which Cockatoo mostly loses. By the late 1970s, the yard's shipbuilding future depends on winning a major naval construction contract. The Commonwealth needs a new fleet replenishment oiler for the Royal Australian Navy. The contract goes to tender. October 1979. Vickers Cockatoo Dockyard wins the HMAS Success contract, $68.4 million at 1978 prices, based on the French Durance-class design. Delivery due 31st of July 1983. The project runs into trouble almost immediately. A protracted dispute between the Commonwealth and Vickers Cockatoo over the drawings and specifications in the French production package. A 1983 Auditor General's report criticises the Department of Defence for failing to ensure the French company had provided the needed package. June 1983. Contract renegotiated. Acceptance extended 3 years. Cost raised to $187.3 million at January 1983 prices. 3rd of March 1984. HMAS Success is launched at Cockatoo Island, launched by Lady Valerie Stephen, wife of Governor-General Sir Ninian Stephen. A huge crowd on the island, Royal Australian Navy Band playing, newsreels rolling, Australian Broadcasting Corporation coverage. 23rd of April 1986, HMAS Success is commissioned. Total project cost at commissioning, approximately $197.4 million. HMAS Success, 18,221 tonnes at full load. 157.2 metres in length, 21.2 metres in beam, 8.6 metres in draft. A fleet replenishment oiler based on the French Durance class, the only one built outside France. HMAS Success is the largest ship ever built in Australia for the Royal Australian Navy and the largest ship ever built in Port Jackson, and she is the last major vessel ever built at Cockatoo Island. Meanwhile, corporate ownership shifts. February 1984, Vickers merges its Australian interests with the Commonwealth Steel Company to form Comsteel Vickers. Vickers 38%, BHP 38%. Smaller investors 24%. 4th of June 1986. 6 weeks after HMAS Success commissions. The company, by then operating as Cockatoo Dockyard Proprietary Limited, is purchased by Australian National Industries. ANI, an Australian engineering conglomerate. Originally John McGrath Industries, renamed ANI in 1956. ANI inherits a yard whose future depends on a Commonwealth lease that is coming up for renewal. Chapter 8. April 1987. April 1987. Federal Defence Minister Kim Beazley of the Hawke Labor government announces a decision. The Cockatoo Island lease will not be renewed. Cockatoo Dockyard Proprietary Limited will run out its current lease. The site will then be sold as a Commonwealth asset, listed for sale in May 1987. The federal rationale, a mid-1980s review of the Royal Australian Navy's East Coast dockyard needs. The Two Oceans Naval Strategy relocating major naval work to Western Australia. And the imminent Collins-class submarine program, Australia's largest ever defence procurement, needs to go somewhere. 3rd of June 1987. Australian Submarine Corporation Proprietary Limited signs with the Commonwealth Government what is, at the time, the largest ever Australian defence contract to build 6 Collins-class submarines, $3.9 billion, to be built at Osborne, South Australia. Adelaide wins, Sydney loses. John Bannon, Labor Premier of South Australia, has won the submarine bid for his state. Prime Minister Bob Hawke and Defence Minister Kim Beazley have chosen to build Australia's future naval submarines in Adelaide, not Sydney. Cockatoo Island's naval future, such as it was, moves to South Australia. New South Wales, traditionally the shipbuilding state, has lost the contest to South Australia. Meanwhile, ANI is running a yard with an ageing workforce, obsolete plant, and no future naval workload. The Cockham's-designed Collins submarines will be built at Osborne. The Oberon-class submarine refit work, Cockatoo's principal remaining business through the 1970s, will end as the Oberon-class boats are retired. June 1989. Kerry Packer's Australian Consolidated Press takes a 48% controlling stake in ANI. Additional financial pressure on the parent company. The Cockatoo workforce collapses, peaked at approximately 2,600 in the early 1980s, down to just over 100 workers by late 1980s. Chapter 9, 14 weeks, May 1989. The Federal Department of Defence invites expressions of interest to sell Cockatoo Island. Advertised as, verbatim, the jewel in the crown for real estate in Sydney Harbour. The Cockatoo Island Dockyard Shop Committee, representing 13 unions on the island, responds, strike. And a 14-week occupation of the island, beginning around the 10th of May 1989. Named leaders of the occupation, Claude Sandalgian, boilermaker of 17 years. Australian Manufacturing Workers Union convener and chairman of the Cockatoo Island Shop Committee. The central organiser, Pat Johnston, Australian Manufacturing Workers Union national organiser and shipwright, Bob Galligan, Federal Secretary of the Ship Painters and Dockers Union. Told a rally on the island, verbatim, there won't be a second ship built unless you're going to do something about it. John Tognolini, Painters and Dockers, Union Life member, later a documentarian of the occupation. The occupation lights a fire visible from the mainland. Sydney harbourside residents watch smoke rise from Cockatoo Island. Approximately 1,000 workers march on Parliament House in Canberra. The Painters and Dockers Union supplies food to the occupying workers on the island. But federal policy holds. The Beazley non-renewal decision from April 1987 is confirmed. The Collins-class submarines will be built in Adelaide. The Cockatoo lease will lapse. What the occupation achieves: improved redundancy packages for the remaining workers, not preservation of the industry, just softer landings for the workforce that federal policy has already committed to laying off. End of December 1991. Cockatoo dockyard operations effectively cease. The last shipwrights walk off the island. 31st of December 1992. The Cockatoo Island lease formally lapses. 135 years after HMS Herald first entered the Fitzroy Dock on the 1st of December 1857. Australia's greatest shipyard, the one that built HMAS Huon, the tribal-class destroyers HMAS Success, and repaired the USS New Orleans stern first, is now Commonwealth-owned scrap. A protracted legal dispute between the Commonwealth and ANI over costs and liabilities continues until May 1997, 5 years after the lease lapse, when it is finally settled. Chapter 10. Sydney Harbour Federation Trust, 1993 through 2001. Cockatoo Island sits idle. Rusted-out shipyard through the 1990s. Environmental contamination from a century of heavy industry, oil, lead paint, asbestos, shipyard waste. The federal government proposes selling Cockatoo Island for private redevelopment through the 1990s. Real estate agencies quietly circle. The advertisement's phrase, "the jewel in the crown for real estate in Sydney Harbour," begins to look prophetic. The Friends of Cockatoo Island, a community activist group, mobilises against private sale. Public campaigns, media pressure, sustained political pressure through the Howard Coalition government elected in March 1996. 1998. The federal government announces the creation of the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust to rehabilitate former defence sites and return them to the public. 20th of September 2001, the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust is formally established under the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust Act 2001. Environmental remediation begins. Extensive contamination cleanup, asbestos removal, lead paint stripping, hydrocarbon soil treatment. 2007. Cockatoo Island opens to the public for the first time since 1992, 31st of July 2010. UNESCO inscribes the Australian convict sites World Heritage Property. 11 sites across Australia. Cockatoo Island, convict site is sub-site 1306-010. Inscribed under UNESCO criteria 4 and 6. John Christopher Jeremy, AM, 1942 to 2025. Naval architect, long-serving Chief Executive Officer of Cockatoo Island Dockyard through the closure years. Principal Historian of the Shipyard. Author of Cockatoo Island, Sydney's historic dockyard, published by University of New South Wales Press in 1998. The definitive history of the site. Died January 2025. The keeper of institutional memory. By the mid-2020s, Cockatoo Island is one of Sydney's most distinctive cultural venues. Short ferry ride from Circular Quay Barangaroo, Darling Harbour, Sydney Biennale signature venue, the 2024 edition. 10,000 Suns, continuing into the 2026 edition. Concerts by Lorde, Justin Bieber, other international artists. 2 licensed cafes, heritage accommodation, camping and glamping, guided history tours, sunset sessions. The industrial workshops survive as gallery space. The 17 historic cranes rust in place. The drydocks remain empty. The 1918 powerhouse, once the largest open-fronted DC generating plant in Australia, is Commonwealth Heritage listed. Fitzroy Dock and Sutherland Dock preserved as UNESCO Heritage features. Working Shipyard becomes tourism site. The badge, the physical infrastructure survives. Just as UNESCO Heritage, the industry, the working shipyard, the shipbuilding workforce, the dry dock operations, does not. Chapter 11. The Empty Docks, 2026. Walk back to Circular Quay. Look across Sydney Harbour at Cockatoo Island. UNESCO World Heritage, Sydney Biennale venue. Distinctive against the Sydney skyline. Meanwhile, at Osborne, South Australia, the Australian Submarine Corporation site, now called ASC Proprietary Limited, still building submarines, currently supporting the AUKUS nuclear submarine program signed in the 2020s. The Collins-class submarines that Beazley chose over Sydney. In June 1987, Adelaide has the submarine work, not Sydney. Meanwhile, at BAE Systems Adelaide, the Hunter-class frigate program, Australian naval shipbuilding continues, in Adelaide, not Sydney. Meanwhile, at Osborne Naval Shipyard, the future of Australian naval shipbuilding sits in South Australia, consolidated into the Adelaide-Osborne precinct through 4 decades of federal industrial concentration policy. Meanwhile, at Cockatoo Island, the Fitzroy Dock opened 1st of December 1857 as Australia's first dry dock is a UNESCO photo opportunity. The Sutherland Dock, completed March 1890 for the largest vessels of the imperial era, is a heritage feature. The 17 cranes rust in place. Workshops with lathes still bolted to the floor are gallery installations for the Sydney Biennale. Meanwhile, at Wariama, Gadigal language name for Cockatoo Island, First Nations history, convict history, shipbuilding history, World War II history, layered together under UNESCO plaques. The Sydney Harbour Federation Trust ferry runs multiple times daily. Tourists photograph the dry docks. Weekend campers pitch tents on grass that once held construction cranes and shipbuilding materiel. Cockatoo Island is beautiful, historic, popular, preserved, and every kilogram of Australia's future naval infrastructure, every submarine, every frigate, every replenishment ship will be built in Adelaide. Or overseas, not in Sydney Harbour, not on the island where HMAS Huon, HMAS Warramunga, HMAS Bataan, HMAS Arunta, HMAS Success, and 150 other Royal Australian Navy vessels were built or repaired between 1857 and 1992, the largest shipyard Australia ever built. Ended by Australian decisions, preserved as a tourism site. Every year, Sydney's ferry brings tourists to see the rust. Almost nobody remembers that in December 1919, 4,085 workers built ships here. Lesson 1. The villain was Australian. Industrial South has now told 42 Australian factory stories. Chrysler Tonsley Park, Nissan Clayton, Ford Broadmeadows, Arnott's Homebush, Hills Edwardstown, Hoadley's South Melbourne. In almost every previous story, the villain has been foreign: American private equity, Japanese boardrooms, Swiss multinationals, British Rowntree acquirers, Griffin Corporation, New York, KKR, Manhattan, Nestlé, Vevey. Cockatoo Island is different. There is no foreign villain here. No hostile bidder from Detroit or Yokohama or London. No offshore corporate raider. No boardroom in Manhattan making the closure decision. The villain is Australian federal government policy. The Hawke Labor government of 1983 to 91, continued by the Keating Labor government of 1991 to 96. Defence Minister Kim Beazley's April 1987 announcement not to renew the Cockatoo Island lease. Prime Minister Bob Hawke's Two Oceans naval strategy that relocated naval work to Western Australia. South Australian Premier John Bannon's successful bid for the Collins-class submarines to Adelaide's Osborne, 3rd of June 1987, $3.9 billion, the largest defence contract in Australian history at the time. Sydney lost Australia's naval future to Adelaide in June 1987, in a decision made by Australian politicians for Australian policy reasons. The villain was Australian. Federal Labor, State Labor, Australian Submarine Corporation, Australian-owned. The decision to close Australia's greatest shipyard was made by Australians. Not everyone the Industrial South Channel documents dies at the hands of a foreign acquirer. Some die at the hands of their own government. The Cockatoo Island closure is not a story of foreign villainy. It is a story of Australian federal decisions that consolidated Australian naval shipbuilding in Adelaide, a legitimate policy choice with cascading consequences for Sydney. Adelaide won, Sydney lost. Both are Australia. Lesson 2. Federal policy chooses winners and losers among Australian states. Australian federal government defence procurement chooses which Australian state gets the naval shipbuilding industry, not the market, not private capital, not international competition, the federal cabinet. Since the Menzies era, this choice has moved across the states. Cockatoo Island, Sydney, was the naval shipbuilding centre from 1913 through the 1972 policy change. Williamstown, Victoria had a substantial naval role through the Anzac frigate program of the 1980s and 90s. Adelaide, South Australia, wins the Collins-class submarines in 1987. Adelaide wins the Air Warfare Destroyer program in the 2000s. Adelaide wins the Hunter-class frigate program in the 2010s. Adelaide wins the AUKUS nuclear submarine program in the 2020s. South Australia has become, over 4 decades of federal policy decisions, Australia's naval shipbuilding capital. Sydney has become tourism. Melbourne has become minimal. Perth has become naval basing, not naval building. Here's the thing. When one Australian state wins the federal naval shipbuilding contract, another Australian state loses. Cockatoo Island's closure in 1992 was the direct consequence of the Collins-class submarine decision going to Adelaide in June 1987. That was not villainy. It was federal industrial concentration. The calculation that Australia is best served by a single major shipbuilding centre rather than multiple competing ones. But every industrial concentration decision creates industrial ghosts elsewhere. Cockatoo Island is one of the ghosts. Williamstown Naval Dockyard is another. Newcastle State Dockyard is another. Whyalla Shipyard is another. The Federation gave the federal government the power to consolidate industry across state boundaries, and federal consolidation of naval shipbuilding to South Australia created the industrial ghost of Cockatoo Island in Sydney Harbour. Lesson 3. Heritage preservation is not industrial continuation. The Sydney Harbour Federation Trust exists. Cockatoo Island is UNESCO World Heritage. The drydocks are preserved. The cranes stand. The workshops hold Sydney Biennale installations. The powerhouse is Commonwealth Heritage listed. The 1918 industrial architecture survives. All of this is genuinely valuable. Heritage preservation of Australian industrial infrastructure prevents Sydney from having demolished Cockatoo Island in 1992 and built luxury apartments as the Federal Defence Department wanted to do. The community activism of Friends of Cockatoo Island, the 14-week 1989 occupation led by Claude Sandaljian and Pat Johnston, the Howard government's 1998 trust proposal, and the 2010 UNESCO inscription all combined to save the physical infrastructure. Cockatoo Island in 2026 is more publicly accessible than it was in 1975, when working shipwrights lived and worked on the island. There is a simple rule at work here. Heritage preservation preserves buildings and machinery. It does not preserve industry. It does not preserve workers. It does not preserve manufacturing capability. It does not preserve the intergenerational transfer of skills from senior shipwright to apprentice on the dry dock floor. In 2026, Cockatoo Island has 0 shipwrights, 0 fitters, 0 engineers on active shipbuilding work. The industrial capability that built HMAS Huon in 1915 and HMAS Success in 1984 is gone. Not lost to demolition, lost to disuse. When an industry is closed for 4 decades, the workforce moves elsewhere or retires. The intergenerational skills chain breaks. The last generation of Cockatoo Island shipwrights, the workers who occupied the island in 1989, are retired or dead. Their apprentices went to Adelaide or offshore or into different industries entirely. The senior shipwrights who taught them how to work the Fitzroy Dock, how to weld the tribal-class hull sections, how to fabricate a temporary bow from steel plate. Those men are gone. Australian shipbuilding continues, but not from Cockatoo Island, not from Sydney Harbour. The badge, the UNESCO plaque, the cranes, the Fitzroy Dock survives. The industry has moved to Adelaide. The physical continuity of Sydney Harbour naval shipbuilding from 1857 to 1992 ended when the last ANI workers walked off the island in December 1991. The heritage plaque came 15 years later. Preservation is not continuation. 31st December 1992, Sydney Harbour, Australia. The Fitzroy Dock remembers. The shipwrights do not.